Yes, hello everyone. My name is Tomasz, and we're developing this together. First of all, I would like to thank Michal and the whole Museum for Architecture from Wrocław for organizing this event. And I hope I can show you a few interesting things. Yeah, this presentation perhaps comes a bit late, but we will then later try to summarize all of the things that came in yesterday and do a small round table and discuss a few things that was on the table. So I'll just go into it. Industrial making and city culture, I will try to go through a few different things. First, I will kind of illustrate what means industrial culture on a more historical example, which is mass production. To give a kind of critical reference to what kind of, let's say, city is produced through that. Then I will talk about post-industrial regeneration, so what happened with these cities that had industries. So I'll talk about the tourism as one such driver, and then as high-tech as one such driver. Then I'll talk about whether there is a third option, whether we can think about any other ways how to regenerate industrial cities. I have here mainly in my mind so the condition we are in the Western world, where majority of let's say city production is centered around tertiary sector, so around things like services, and there is no more real physical things that we produce. It's interesting to host this here in Wrocław, where there is still a lot of industry, and that this kind of question, what this industry brings to the city, is quite relevant. And I hope we can get some of those inputs from our local hosts as well. So this is where I would like to start as a kind of example of what is, or let's say what technology and industrial technology brought to the cities. This is one of the first plants in Detroit, where it's called Highland Park Ford plant, where they were producing, where they started with a mass production. And the first mass production was actually done on a magneto assembly. That's part of the engine. And what started to happen was right before people were working on the whole process. Now one person was doing just one thing, and through this they were able to create this object in 5 minutes instead of 15, and cut the workforce from 29 to 14. So it was a really big kind of saving, or also economical and time-wise and so on. So, however, on this, let's say, what also created was a completely kind of a new type of understanding what production is, or let's say what this production gives to the city. One thing that started to permeate into, let's say, popular culture are things like this. So we all know the Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, who is quite critical about what is happening with production. So on one side is drudgery that comes with always doing a repetitive task. And the other thing is on the basis of problems, on the basis of, let's say, giving the knowledge from people to the machines through the Taylorism, so to this very strict way of understanding what each individual person has to do. This is also another kind of a problem that we see in those times. But we have to understand that it wasn't just a very negative, you don't have just negative things. On the other hand, what started to happen was that people started to get new wares and new products that they were able to use. So everyday people, like workers in the factories, they got refrigerators, they were able to buy television sets. And it is, let's say, the first time in the history when, a working family can afford a car. And this thoroughly changes the way how someone uses the city, someone uses the space, how someone interacts in the cities. So let's say beforehand, people were, the excursions into nature were much more part of the higher class. This is something that was reserved for them. Right now, were able to, let's say, on Saturdays and Sundays, people were able to go to nature and do these kind of excursions. And that was a really big shift in the way how people started to use their free time, which is also a free time as such is a kind of a very modern or contemporary invention. Another thing, how they used the free time was this kind of things, right? The department store started to come about. And the consumerism culture started because of, on one side, the amount of products that were produced, and on the other side, because of these products had to be consumed and used. Nowadays, we see consumerist culture quite, very negative. But we have to understand that back then it meant something very, personal and a personal achievement of all these workers that were working in these companies. Personal achievement was also kind of very present in what was portrayed as an achievement of the culture. This is a postcard that is showing this Ford Motor Company plant and all the hustle and bustle of life around it. So people were really proud of the industry. They were proud of what they were doing, and it was a kind of I call it a civic pride of the workers, that they personified themselves with the industries as such. That was also kind of true for the way how morphologically these things were put together, right? Nowadays, we have this strict separation between, city life and then the industrial production, which is somewhere on the outskirts. Of course, we can talk about economic and other efficiencies that are the reason for that. But back then, let's say this connection between the production and the life, everyday life, was much more intense. Wasn't so just in Detroit. This is something that maybe it's closer to Europe. This is Peter Behrens' Halle in Moabit, Berlin. So the Turbine Factory where they were creating turbines, and you can feel this kind of connection between the industrial parts and the housing or free time, let's say, or after work parts of the city. And I think this talks a lot about, what was the place of industry and of production in that times. And I think it was much more positive than what we see today. We don't anymore in the West kind of connect to that in that way. So another thing that started to happen was, because of the free time and because of the huge amount of workers and so on, a lot of group sports started to emerge, which were, of course, football is not from the 1920s, it was before, but all of the industrial towns have really good football clubs or hockey clubs or so on. And this is one example of Manchester United. I'm sure you all know it, but I don't know if you know that it started as a railway football club in 1878. And it shows also how let's say, industries were kind of an umbrella for public life as well. And this is something that let's say, smaller industrial towns still have. Let's say in Slovenia, in Jesenice, where we had a steel factory, you still have one of the best hockey clubs in the region, maybe. We can move on to, let's say, higher culture or more artistic part, where you start to think about, what kind of consequences brought the technology and so on. These are some examples from futurism from Italy. We have some Italians around. I'm sure they will know a bit more about it than I. But it's about praising the technology. Maybe a few questions about, futurism are for a bigger discussion, but this shows just about how fascinating the idea of technology and all of the life connected to it is. Or a more, let's say, realistic approach, this is Diego Rivera in Detroit Institute of Art. There is a main hall, it's kind of this size, where it has 4 murals on each side praising the local industries in that time. Here you can see Rivera plant, foundry and production of the car engine block. Another one which is a bit later that came around, let's say this is an artistic movement which originated in Italy, and it's actually looking at more kind of the consumerism part and the negative part of it, which is developed in the 1960s. It's called arte povera, and this is povera, and this is maybe already going into the direction that you start to question how does the production and the things that happen in the West develop later. We all know that through globalization we lost a lot of the production. Maybe it's not so much felt in Poland and in Wrocław in particular, but in general in Europe, you can feel a lot of the places dying out because of the moving of parts of the production to places like China and so on. And so where did it move? Like I said, China and so on. The problem is that, or the question is that what kind of culture we reproduced through extending these production chains globally. Like if we compare this to images, we can see roughly, let's say, same amount of people, maybe a bit less in China, but the way how the life and the space is structured is something completely different. It also means that it's something completely different in terms of what access these people had to wares and products that they are doing. And this is saying a lot about what industry is or what industry was. So what happened in the West? I think one of the main, let's say, problems that I see is that this split between what I call city of ideas and city of production. So on one side you have all the knowledge economy and all the things connected to ideas how to produce something, to engineering, to education about high-tech technology. On the other side you have the production and the knowledge that is embedded in that. So when we lost the industrial production as such, we didn't lose just working places. We also lost all the knowledge that is embedded in people that do these things. Some part of that process definitely is quite rudimentary and quite repetitive, but things like welding, things like doing very specialistic tasks, those things all went away. And I will come back to that. Why I think this is so important is this is a small example. It's based on an arts and crafts idea, but just to give an illustration, let's say traditionally, this would be a jewelry making store in the city where you would have, let's say on one side, is there a mouse? No mouse. Okay, in the front you would have a place where you would greet your customer. At the back would be a workshop where you would have a knowledge transfer of making from master to apprentice and so on. On the top you would have a master's house and apprentice's house. So this kind of a connection between daily life and the work, it's very intense, and it's also weaved into the city life, right? Nowadays, if we think about what happens through this, it's, let's say, at the back you would get a storage. You would house the wares. In front you would sell the wares that you actually bring in globally. Sell it to a much wider audience because the wares have to be cheaper. On top, what usually happens, you get hostel dorms or hotels that has kind of a catering mainly for tourists. And I think this kind of life becomes much more flat, much more catering only for one thing, right? And in the old times, or let's say in the times of the craft and these kind of societies, what you had was an environment which had different types of production interweaved into the city. Nowadays, these all things become just a representation, perhaps, of these practices gearing towards tourism. So what happened to all our industrial cities? Well, the majority was abandonment and, of course, regeneration. quickly to go through a few kind of practices of regeneration, which I think were taken mainly as models, but do not consider, let's say, they do not consider the local specificities, and therefore sometimes they are problematic. We all know about the revitalization of industrial regions through culture. This is one example of such, using old abandoned industrial buildings in this way. Or let's say, we all know about Bilbao, where they've used a very popular architectural icon to revitalize areas and bring in, let's say, a kind of culture, but a very populistic culture, which is basically gearing towards tourism, and in a way how, let's say, contemporary practices of showing the arts and crafts movement within the cities are making city flat. Also, this kind of a culture creates a very flat kind of an environment, because it's again a kind of culture that is geared toward, let's say, a wow, and people who come just to see things that are not local, but are just there for the sake of you could say, almost a touristic economy. The other type of tourism is based on leisure. So revitalization of this kind of industrial areas through, let's say, this is an example in Ruhr, where you can go there, you cycle around, you also see some of the processes. But another problem that I see here is this, right? How can you compete with, south of Europe, where you have really nice beaches, and of course people will mainly go for this one. And I like this quote where he says, like, there is no guarantee that a tourism based on nostalgia of a departed industrial past will prove more attractive to consumers than one based on sun, sea, and sand. So the reason why it's so is because of this, right? This image actually gets transported into this like economical reality. And this is the reason why the tourism can support an economy, let's say, in the south. And this is more on the level of the industry that was there, this 100 almost years ago already. And when you think about it in that sense, it is really hard to see that only tourism will be able to provide a viable future for post-industrial cities. No? Of course, this usually happens with a mix of things. Another one is what I was mentioning before, this craft heritage. This is an example from Slovenia. This is lacing, which was traditionally done in a mining town in Slovenia, in Idrija. There are a few, let's say, positive or contemporary implementations, like connecting it to fashion industry. But I think it's again really hard to think about it on a scale to provide economic viability for the whole area, right? This is an annual festival that they organize. But the thing is that the area is, let's say, Idrija is quite well off. It's a small town, but they live quite well because economically they are positioned really well. But it's not because of the lacing, but it's because of these guys that you see at the back here, which is called collector. Collector is one industry which is actually connected to auto industry in basically in Germany and so on. Very similar to things that are happening in Poland, but on much smaller scale. We are much more connected to high-tech innovation and really small production of very specialized parts. And this is basically what drives this kind of areas. And I think we shouldn't forget about that now. Another way how regeneration happened was through knowledge transfers and through the innovation, let's say this hype around innovation, which is very much present around all of our towns and cities lately. I will give just a small overview of where are the limits of this. This is Shinola. It's a company in Detroit, which they bought knowledge, they transferred knowledge from Switzerland to make watches. So they re-educated local people to give them jobs and so on. So you have this kind of a success story. They are really happy about their production place within Detroit physically. They are connecting with the local design school for new services and new products that they can develop. So it's this really kind of a success story about offering to locals new jobs and new opportunities, and also regenerating the local economy on basis of knowledge transfer and technology. But what we have to understand is this kind of a nested kind of ecology that happens within it. So if you want to have on the top right this kind of assembly of watches, which is actually part of the building where this design school is, and this all is part of the city, and it creates this really varied and interesting environment around which then you have nice cafes, right? You have incubators, you have all the people that can be connected to this kind of ecology. But what usually people don't understand is that behind this there are at least two more levels. First is a seed fund. In this case, there is this seed fund called Bedrock. Bedrock is owned by a guy called Kartsotis. And he's the owner of Fossil. And Fossil is one of the biggest producers of watches and upholstery all around the world. And they have the managerial skills, they have the global connections, they have all the infrastructure that you need in order to facilitate something like this. So in this sense, I would be a bit critical, let's say, about co-working spaces and all this innovation which is happening, because I think that in majority of times no one really considers the whole ecology of what it actually brings about or what it means to be successful. I think we have to look at it much more thoroughly, which is something like this. So this brings us to, let's say, my kind of, this is kind of a last point and a conclusion. So is there a third option, right? So we have this kind of regenerations on basis of or innovation or tourism. In a lot of times it is used very on the basis of, let's say, models. As an example, the rural region, how it was modernized through or regenerated through culture is used as a model everywhere, but no one really takes care. It's not so well known that the amount of money that the Germany actually put into the rural region was amazing. So I'm wondering whether there is kind of another option, which is rethinking whether some kind of a making can still be part of the Western culture. And I think some of this is definitely quite well seen in Wrocław, how powerful still the industrial production is and what kind of city it can create, which is not so much different from the city which would be only based on, let's say, innovation in services that are connected to the tertiary sector. This is one example of what they are calling now insourcing. Insourcing means that they're bringing back the production from let's say, China or India and so on. This is again an American example. GE Appliances brought back production of industrial heaters, of water heaters. And what they actually did was they brought together the knowledge of people who were assembling it and who were creating the piping of it with the engineers and reworked it to see, let's say, what part of the process could be better done, or what type of skills you would need in certain type of a process so that it would be better. And through this, they were able to eliminate 20% of parts and 30% of equipment that is needed. And at the end, they were able to produce these heaters cheaper, basically, than in China with the local labor force in US. And I think this is one such success story. Now, let's say the jury on insourcing is still out, which means that not all of the parts of the let's say production process can be brought back. But the question is, but I think it's really important that at least we try to retain some of it, or let's say try to reintroduce it to an extent so that we don't lose that kind of knowledge. And the question is why and how to do that. Why on one side is retaining the know-how, is also retaining cultural and technical knowledge for long-term future. So I don't think that, traditionally when you had these industrial places, they were really much focused on one industry, which meant that when that industry went away, the really big economical consequences followed. And I think diversifying is one of the better things. So diversifying the economy based by bringing back the production. One thing is that production needs to be quite flexible because we don't do any more mass production. So doing it locally, it's also better for the local market because you can have smaller, let's say, batches and so on. Another thing is quality control, something that you don't have when you have a production based across the world on the other side. And how to do that? Well, I think one thing is supporting this skill building and research into making, into actual production as such. Connect the producers and makers with the engineers, something that we lost in the last 30 years. Let's say also in terms of education, the schools that are based on making, so vocational schools, are not anymore popular. So I think it's also about popularizing back what it means to work in an industry, because it's definitely not anymore being a very filthy job, but it's something that is much more closer to, it's much cleaner, it's much more accessible to a modern way or contemporary way of life. I would finish with this. So I think it's also about a cultural shift in value of what production and making is, and through that we can create a more long-term futures for cities. Kind of maybe a thought to finish this off. Yeah. Thank you very much.